If we are to understand Abraham Lincoln from our California perspective, we need to examine his speech on the war with Mexico, which was his most noteworthy act during his one term in Congress. His speech was memorable but ineffective, as Lincoln was suspicious and harshly critical of President James K. Polk's justifications for the U.S. entry into the war. Seemingly the war was started over a border dispute between Mexico and Texas. However, the real prize for the war was the Golden State. California was the jewel coveted by the Manifest Destiny movement and the great reward of the Mexican War. Lincoln had supported a resolution that criticized the constitutionality and necessity of the war, while he also had proposed what became known as his spot resolution to question the president's claim of the attack that had pushed the U.S. into the war with Mexico. Lincoln's arguments centered around two main ideas: the president's seemingly constant attempts at gaining support and his lack of factual evidence. Lincoln, however, also took his speech a step or two further, as he made a number of personal attacks against the president that stand out from his other speeches in their vitriol. In fact, this is what most modern historians note about his criticism. As it was, the speech came to nothing, as the president paid no attention, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was concluded a few weeks later, and California became American territory. Lincoln ostensibly had given his speech in support of his spot resolution, in which he questioned whether the spot where the bloodshed that had precipitated the war had actually occurred on American soil as the president had claimed. He listed out 8 different questions intended to draw the president out and have him explain exactly where the spot was and how it was that Mexico had invaded our territory and shed the blood of our fellow citizens on our soil, as Polk had said they had. Lincoln's interrogatories were looking to figure out how territory Lincoln felt was disputed could be claimed by the president as unequivocally American land. He asked how that land had been connected to Spain, Mexico, and/or Texas, how it had been settled, which country had jurisdiction, how the people who lived in the area reacted to the different armies, and why that American force was in the area. He felt this type of interrogation was needed to clearly justify the shedding of American blood and spending treasure to get California. The fine-tooth comb with which Lincoln approached Polk's reasoning for the war presents one with insights into Lincoln's understanding of how a president and his party should approach prosecuting a war. Once he was elected to Congress, Lincoln began researching and questioning the Mexican War, and he realized that President Polk's decisions were not grounded in rock-solid facts and were more like what he would have liked to have happened. Polk and the Democrats, on the other hand, had been elected on a wave of Manifest Destiny. Lincoln's speech implied that they wanted the facts to fit the war. They wanted to get California. They had tried to buy it. Once they were refused, they knew they needed to fight to get it. Then they just needed an excuse to fight a war. They had their war when the Mexicans attacked American troops in the disputed land between the Rio Nueces and the Rio Grande. Most of the American people and politicians were happy to take the president at his word, as they also wanted to get California and achieve Manifest Destiny. Lincoln felt that Polk was supporting the war against Mexico with arguments and not facts, and that Polk should hold himself to the standard of George Washington and answer the questions unequivocally. As Lincoln said, a nation should not, and the Almighty will not, be evaded. So let him attempt no evasion, no equivocation. Lincoln said that if Polk cannot answer in this manner, Lincoln would know that Polk had realized that he was in the wrong. As with most Americans, Lincoln said he would have been willing to take the president at his word. He explained that he had hoped to reserve his criticism and justification for the war until after the hostilities, as good citizens and patriots would. He pointed to Democrat former President Martin Van Buren as an ally of the president who was doing the same. However, the president and his fellow Democrats kept pushing every vote on supplies as an endorsement for the war. Lincoln showed how they twisted the vote tallies to show support for the war was stronger than it really was. The real support was for the American war effort and the American troops, as opposed to the war itself. As Lincoln said, Polk was trying to prove by telling the truth what he could not prove by telling the whole truth. Again, Lincoln was implying that Polk was twisting the facts to fit his goals. When Lincoln's speech is read, one can easily agree with modern historians who criticize Lincoln's speech for being out of touch with the American people and overly personal and harsh toward President Polk, as Doris Kearns Goodwin has described it. Michael Burlingame also saw Lincoln's speech as off base, as he felt it was overly political, and he felt that a passage on the revolutionary history of the territories of Mexico and Texas would come back to haunt him during the run-up to the Civil War. William Miller, on the other hand, lauded Lincoln for his ardor in making the case against the legitimacy of the war's beginning, after criticizing Lincoln's tone as being rather personal and nasty toward Polk in a quite un-Lincolnian way. Again, Lincoln's speech was sharply critical, but in the end, ineffectual. After he explained his reasons for proposing his resolution and criticizing the war and the president, Lincoln took off the gloves and began to hit the Polk administration with bare knuckles on an issue that was overwhelmingly popular in the United States. He questioned both the president's veracity and perhaps even his sanity as he read through a list of different reasons that had been used by the administration for the war. How, like the half-insane mumbling of a fever dream, is the whole war part of his late message? He finally finished his speech as he felt that the president was confused. He is a bewildered, confounded, and miserably perplexed man. God grant he may be able to show that there is not something about his conscience more painful than all his mental perplexity. The level of personal attack illustrated how strongly he felt Polk had not met the standard of explanation, and thus the war and the president were wrong. At the same time, Lincoln's speech made little lasting impression, as his resolutions were not voted on by the House, and the war was prosecuted for a few more weeks, and Lincoln, as he had promised, did not seek a second term. Modern historians agree. However, he would become president, and he would lead the United States through the Civil War and gain a reputation as one of the best presidents in U.S. history. This speech is significant when one views how Lincoln attacked Polk's inability to factually justify how the war began, and then used more meticulous processes in making and justifying major decisions during the Civil War.